The smell of burnt toast filled the tiny apartment as Violet scraped at the blackened edges with the kind of determination usually reserved for bigger battles. Leo sat at the wobbly kitchen table, kicking his legs in mismatched socks, his mouth moving in an endless stream of morning chatter. She only caught half of it, something about a superhero with laser eyes, something about a kid in his class who could burp the alphabet, but most of her focus was on calculating if they had enough peanut butter to last until payday. She checked the time on her phone and let out a groan. 20 minutes before she had to be at the diner for the breakfast shift, which meant she had 10 minutes to drop Leo off at preschool, 5 to half jog the 7 blocks to work, and exactly 0 to breathe. The idea of breathing was a luxury. So were naps, haircuts, and anything that didn't directly involve keeping the electricity on and food in the fridge. She handed Leo his toast, now mostly scraped clean of the char, and kissed the top of his head. He wrinkled his nose but took a bite anyway. They had an unspoken agreement: he ate whatever she put in front of him, and she didn't remind him that she was doing her best with what she had. Naomi showed up at the diner around noon, sliding into the booth while Violet was clearing a table. She didn't even bother with a greeting. "I have something for you," she said, her voice dangerously close to what it sounded like when she was about to convince Violet to do something stupid. Violet wiped her hands on her apron and gave her a look. "Last time you had something for me, I ended up selling protein shakes to strangers in a Facebook group." Naomi waved a dismissive hand. "That was a minor misstep. This is different." Violet sat down across from her, too exhausted to argue. Naomi's excitement was almost offensive in contrast to her own bone-deep fatigue. "There's this charity auction. Fancy place, big donors, lots of money flying around. They do this thing where they auction off experiences, weekend getaways, yacht parties, that kind of stuff. But the big attraction is the model auction." Violet raised an eyebrow. "Not like that," Naomi said quickly, reading her mind. "It's basically rich people bidding on an afternoon with a beautiful person. Like a lunch date or a museum visit. Nothing sketchy, I swear. Just handshakes, polite conversation, and a check with a lot of zeros." Violet took a sip of her water, unimpressed. "You don't even have to do anything. Just walk across a stage in a nice dress and smile. You get a guaranteed payment just for showing up." "Define nice dress," Violet said. "Not one that smells like maple syrup and stress." Violet sighed, pressing her fingers against her temples. She already knew where this was going. "Naomi, I don't have time for this." "You don't have time to make easy money?" Naomi folded her arms. "Because you're too busy working double shifts and barely scraping by. Come on, Vi. This is cash for nothing. It's cash for being paraded in front of rich people like a prize goat." "A prize goat with rent money," Naomi shot back. "And you get paid just for showing up. Even if no one bids, you still walk away with a check." Violet hated how tempting that sounded. She was about to launch into another round of excuses when her phone vibrated on the table. A message from her landlord. Final notice. Rent due in full by Friday. No exceptions. Her stomach twisted. Naomi must have seen something in her face because her voice softened. "Vi, I know it's not ideal. But it's one night. A few hours of smiling in a fancy dress. And then you walk away with enough money to breathe a little." Violet exhaled slowly. "I don't even own a fancy dress." Naomi grinned. "Luckily, I plan for these things." That was how she found herself standing in front of a mirror 3 nights later, wearing a floor-length emerald green dress that clung in all the right places. Naomi had found it in the back of her closet and declared it perfect. Violet, on the other hand, was still debating whether she looked elegant or like she had accidentally wandered into a wedding she wasn't invited to. She smoothed her hands down the fabric and practiced her most convincing smile. This was nothing. Just a charity event. A couple of hours of small talk. Easy money. She just had to make it through the night. Soft candlelight flickered over polished marble, casting a warm glow across the ballroom's towering ceilings. The scent of champagne and expensive perfume lingered in the air as waiters weaved through clusters of impeccably dressed guests, balancing trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres. Violet clutched a flute of sparkling water, watching the crowd with a mixture of amusement and sheer disbelief. She had expected something extravagant, but this was something else entirely. The auction was well underway, and so far, the items had ranged from extravagant to absurd. A private yacht weekend in the Mediterranean had just gone for an amount that could buy her apartment building 3 times over. A billionaire's personal chef was up next, promising to cook an intimate dinner for 2, and Violet found herself wondering what a meal prepared by a man who had worked in actual palaces would taste like. It was easy to forget, in all the opulence, that she was supposed to be part of the show. She smoothed her dress, forcing herself to breathe. Naomi had assured her this was just a harmless way for wealthy donors to flaunt their generosity. Some of the models had done this before, chatting casually, utterly unbothered by the prospect of being auctioned off for an afternoon of polite conversation. It was all pretend, she told herself. A performance. A ripple of applause signaled the end of the last bid, and the auctioneer stepped back to the podium with a practiced smile. The crowd quieted. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the main event of the evening, the highly anticipated model bidding segment. The energy in the room shifted. Glasses clinked, low murmurs filled the space, and people turned their attention to the stage. Violet's stomach tightened. A small group of men near the front grinned in anticipation, flipping through their bidding paddles like this was some kind of game. One by one, the models were introduced, each striding onto the stage with the kind of confidence Violet wished she could fake. The bids climbed at an almost ridiculous speed, lavish sums exchanged with a flick of the wrist. The highest bid so far was for a leggy blonde in a crimson dress, whose final price tag was whispered behind carefully manicured hands. Naomi, standing beside her, nudged her lightly. "Relax," she whispered. "Smile. Own it." Before she could reply, her name was being called. The lights felt brighter as she stepped forward, forcing her legs to move in the direction of the stage. The moment stretched, the sound of her heels against the polished floor absurdly loud in her ears. The auctioneer gestured toward her with a sweeping motion, and the room turned its gaze on her. "Our next auction lot, an absolute vision in emerald," he announced. "The lovely Violet, who will be offering an exclusive experience to the highest bidder." Her nerves were on fire, but she smiled, keeping her posture poised. This was just a few moments of discomfort. She could handle discomfort. "And let's start the bidding at 20,000. A paddle lifted almost immediately, and the auctioneer barely had time to acknowledge it before another followed. The crowd hummed with interest, and the bids climbed. Violet exhaled slowly, willing herself to stay composed. It was almost amusing. The whole thing felt like an absurd joke, one she was somehow in the middle of. Watching the numbers go up, she had a fleeting thought that maybe she could get used to this. Then the auctioneer's next words stopped her cold. 1 year of personal assistance services to the highest bidder. The crowd laughed. A few people clapped. Someone whistled. Violet's smile froze in place. She turned slightly, expecting Naomi to correct the mistake, but her friend was just as stunned, mouth open mid-sip of champagne. There had to be a misunderstanding. She took a step forward, trying to get the auctioneer's attention, but he was already taking new bids. "Gentlemen, let's be generous now. Do I hear 80,000? 80,000. Someone laughed loudly, tossing up a paddle. The number on the screen changed. "Excellent. How about 90? She tried again, her voice catching in her throat. "I think there's been a mistake." More laughter. Applause. They thought she was playing along. The numbers shot up. Paddle after paddle went up, and the air buzzed with a kind of electric energy. Violet's stomach twisted. This wasn't a weekend brunch or a museum date, this was a contract for a year. She turned toward Naomi, panic flashing in her eyes. Naomi was already elbowing someone at the side of the stage, frantically whispering. The auctioneer, oblivious, was still going, his voice rising in excitement. 200,000. The sheer audacity of the number made her head spin. At one of the front tables, a group of men cheered as one of their own raised his paddle higher. They were nudging him, laughing, pushing him to keep going. He looked almost reluctant at first, but then someone clapped him on the back, and he gave in, lifting his paddle once more. The auctioneer grinned. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a new bidder, Mr. Elijah Carter, at 250,000. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't noticed him before, but now, with all eyes on him, it was impossible to miss. He sat back in his chair, expression unreadable, fingers resting against his temple. His tuxedo was effortlessly tailored, his presence commanding. The name rang somewhere in the back of her mind, but she was too overwhelmed to place it. Someone else threw in a higher bid. Then another. Elijah Carter barely moved, only lifting his paddle once more, his expression calm. A hush settled. 300,000, the auctioneer declared. Silence stretched for a beat before the crowd erupted in applause. No one was willing to outbid him. The auctioneer, delighted, beamed. Well then. Sold to Mr. Carter for $300,000. The gavel fell. Violet stared at the man who had just purchased a year of her life, heart pounding. She took a breath, ready to protest, ready to demand they fix the mistake. But before she could get a single word out, the auctioneer was already shaking hands, congratulating the winner, announcing that the contracts would be finalized immediately. A staff member approached with a clipboard, smiling like this was the best outcome possible. Naomi grabbed her arm. Vi. She swallowed hard. The contract was already being processed. Violet barely registered the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floors as she was ushered backstage, her pulse pounding in her ears. The noise from the ballroom, laughter, champagne glasses clinking, the hum of conversation, grew distant, muffled by the heavy velvet curtain separating her from the chaos she had just escaped. She turned to the event coordinator, breathless, her words tumbling out in a rush. There's been a mistake, she said, her voice tight. I wasn't supposed to be auctioned off for a year. It was supposed to be an afternoon. A lunch. Something simple. The woman, clipboard in hand, barely spared her a glance. It's all in the contract. No, it's not. I never agreed to this. A man in a headset gave her a polite but indifferent smile. All participants signed waivers. The details of the arrangements were made clear. Violet let out a sharp breath. They weren't made clear to me. The woman glanced at her clipboard and sighed. Your contract has already been processed. Mr. Carter's legal team is reviewing it as we speak. Violet froze. Mr. Carter. Elijah Carter, she asked, the name barely making it past her lips. The woman nodded, flipping a page. 300,000. He bid generously. Her stomach dropped. She was still shaking her head when they guided her through a corridor lined with gilded sconces, stopping in front of an ornate double door. The man in the headset pressed a hand to his earpiece, nodded once, then gestured for her to enter. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, untouched by the revelry outside. A low fire crackled in the marble fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the room's deep leather furniture. A bar cart sat in the corner, untouched. The city skyline glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a breathtaking view Violet barely noticed. Because standing at the center of it all, hands tucked into his pockets, was Elijah Carter. Her breath caught. For 6 years, his face had existed only in memory, in blurred fragments she had tried to push away. He looked the same and entirely different. His sharp jawline was familiar, as were those dark eyes, but there was something colder about him now. More controlled. Calculated. She gripped the fabric of her dress, her nails pressing into the silk. He didn't recognize her. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You're quiet." Violet swallowed, forcing her voice to work. "I wasn't expecting to be here." "That makes two of us," he said smoothly, though there was no real warmth in it. "I wasn't planning on bidding tonight, but things got interesting." She tried to steady herself, to think, to find a way out of this. "This is a mistake." He raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" Violet clenched her jaw. "I didn't sign up for a year-long contract." There was a mix-up. Elijah exhaled, as if she had mildly inconvenienced him. "That's an issue to take up with the auction's organizers. But from where I stand, I made a legal transaction." Her fingers curled at her sides. "I'm not a transaction." His gaze flicked over her, appraising, like she was an equation he was solving. "I don't need a personal assistant," he admitted, almost to himself. "But I did just pay $300,000 for one." She wanted to scream. A waiter entered silently, setting a glass of whiskey on the side table before disappearing just as quickly. Elijah reached for it, rolling the glass between his fingers. "Sit." She didn't move. His eyes lifted to hers again, this time with the kind of intensity that made it clear he wasn't used to being ignored. She took a slow breath and forced herself to sit. The silence stretched, heavy with all the words she couldn't say. 6 years. 6 years since she'd last seen him, since the night that changed everything. She had been a waitress at a hotel bar back then, working the late shift to cover rent. It had been an ordinary night, nothing remarkable, until he walked in. She remembered the way heads turned, the way he moved through the room like he owned it. He had ordered a scotch, neat, and ended up staying until last call. She hadn't known who he was, not then. He hadn't offered, and she hadn't asked. What she did know was that he made her laugh. That there had been something about the way he looked at her that made the world feel a little smaller, like they were the only two people in it. She had let herself believe, for one night, that it didn't matter who he was or who she wasn't. And then he was gone. She hadn't even known his full name until she saw it in the business section of a discarded newspaper at a coffee shop 2 weeks later. By then, she had already taken 3 pregnancy tests. He had left for London to expand his empire. She had stayed behind, raising a son he never knew existed. Now, sitting across from him in a penthouse suite, he didn't even remember her. She dug her nails into her palm, steadying herself. This wasn't the moment to tell him. She had kept this secret for 6 years, not out of spite, but out of certainty that it was the right choice. She had no idea what kind of man he really was. What if he had laughed in her face? Dismissed her? Told her she was making a mistake keeping the baby? She had been terrified back then. She had chosen Leo, and she hadn't regretted it for a second. But now, Elijah was right in front of her. And Leo had his eyes. She could feel the truth pressing against her ribs, begging to be spoken. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap and forced her voice to be steady. "I want out of this contract." Elijah took a sip of whiskey. "That's not how contracts work." Her patience was thinning. "You don't need an assistant." He tilted his head slightly. "No. But I do need to make sure my money wasn't wasted." Her breath caught. "Wasted?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Think of it as an investment. And I expect a return." Her heart pounded. The choice was clear. Either she found a way out, or she spent the next 12 months working for the father of her child, a man who had no idea what he had left behind. Elijah Carter didn't believe in wasted money. Every investment had to yield results. Every transaction had to be justified. That was the world he was raised in, the only world that made sense. And the woman sitting across from him, jaw clenched, back stiff, was now part of that equation. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The dress was elegant, but he could tell she wasn't used to wearing something like it. Her hands were curled into fists against the fabric, her breathing measured, like she was counting down in her head. "I don't know what kind of arrangement you thought this was," he said, voice even, "but I expect a return on my investment." Violet exhaled through her nose. There was a mistake. "Then take it up with the auction house," he cut in. "Not my problem." Her lips pressed together so tightly they turned white. $300,000, he continued. "I assume you're aware that's not a small amount." She glared at him. "I didn't ask you to bid." He almost smiled. There was something oddly refreshing about her sharpness. No flattery, no meekness. She wasn't trying to charm him, which made her different from nearly everyone he interacted with. "You entered the auction," he pointed out. "I entered for a one-day charity event. Not this." He wasn't particularly interested in the distinction. Doesn't change the fact that a contract was signed. 1 year. Full-time. She shook her head, disbelief in every movement. "You don't even need an assistant." "Maybe not. But I own a company with 1,000 employees, and I know how to put people to work." He set his glass on the table, watching her reaction. "You'll be working directly for me." She scoffed, arms folding across her chest. "Doing what? Scheduling your haircuts? Ordering your coffee?" He considered her for a moment. "I haven't decided yet." Her brows shot up. "You bid 300 grand without knowing what you were bidding for?" "I bid because I don't like losing." Her mouth opened slightly, as if she was about to say something, then closed again. He didn't blame her for being confused. Most people assumed he was purely strategic, that every move was calculated to the last decimal point. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Sometimes he did things on instinct. Sometimes he made decisions just to see how the outcome played out. His father would have called that reckless. Growing up in the Carter household meant understanding power before you understood anything else. It wasn't enough to have money. Money could be lost. The real game was control, controlling markets, people, outcomes. There was no patience for weakness, no tolerance for mistakes. He learned quickly. He built Carter Tech from a promising startup into a billion-dollar empire, one acquisition at a time. He was efficient. Uncompromising. He had no time for distractions, and even less for sentimentality. He glanced at the woman across from him. A mistake or not, Violet was part of the deal now. She was still staring at him like she wanted to throw something. Finally, she pushed back from the table, her movements sharp. "This is ridiculous. I have a life. I have responsibilities. I can't just," she hesitated, then lifted her chin. "I have a son." The words landed in the air between them. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "And?" Her hands curled at her sides. "And that means I can't just work at your beck and call for a year." Something flickered across her face, something guarded, but it was gone before he could place it. He wasn't sure what reaction she expected, but he wasn't particularly moved. "People with kids work all the time." Her jaw tightened. "Not like this." "I paid good money," he said simply. "You knew what you were signing up for." The second the words left his mouth, he saw something shift in her expression. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It was something deeper. A crack, a flicker of something raw. For the briefest second, she looked like he had just struck a nerve so deep it physically hurt. Then she laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that suggested anything was funny. It was sharp, bitter, exhausted. "You don't even remember, do you?" she said, more to herself than to him. He frowned. What? She shook her head, then turned, walking straight for the door. He let her go. He wasn't worried. She'd be back. Violet's first official day as Elijah Carter's assistant began at exactly 6 a.m. She knew this because her phone buzzed with a schedule update before the sun had even risen, listing an absurd number of meetings, calls, and tasks with time slots so tight they left no room to breathe. There was no message from him, no greeting, just cold efficiency. By 7:30, she was at Carter Tech's headquarters, standing in an office that looked less like a workspace and more like the lair of a man who had never known a moment of disorganization in his life. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline, sleek furniture gleamed without a fingerprint in sight, and a massive glass desk held precisely 3 items: a laptop, a pen, and a single sheet of paper that, as far as she could tell, existed just for aesthetics. Elijah barely acknowledged her when she entered. He was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than her entire year's salary, if she actually had a salary. He ended the call, turning to her without preamble. Your schedule is in the system. You'll be managing my travel, overseeing the administrative team, and sitting in on all strategy meetings. Any questions? Violet resisted the urge to laugh. Yeah. When do I eat? His expression didn't change. You have a 15-minute break at noon. She stared at him, waiting for him to crack a smile. Nothing. He wasn't joking. By 10, she had already been assigned 5 separate projects, each with expectations so unreasonable she was convinced he had cloned himself in order to accomplish this much in a day. At 11, he handed her a file the size of a small encyclopedia and told her he needed an analysis of it by the afternoon. She looked at him, incredulous. Do you think I have superpowers? If you do, that would be a productive use of them, he replied, already moving on to the next task. The problem wasn't just the workload. It was the complete lack of flexibility. Meetings ran late with no warning, emails poured in at a rate she couldn't keep up with, and whenever she tried to steal a second to check her phone, there was something else waiting for her attention. At noon, she stepped into a bathroom stall, phone in hand, and called Naomi. I think he's trying to break me. Naomi snorted. You lasted 5 hours. That's impressive. I'm not joking. He has no concept of time. Or food. Or, I don't know, human limitations. Then tell him the truth, Naomi said, her voice quieter now. Tell him about Leo. Violet squeezed her eyes shut. No. He's your son's father, Violet. He's a machine in a suit, she snapped. He wouldn't care. A knock on the bathroom door made her jump. Someone from the office was calling her name, letting her know that Elijah was looking for her. She hung up and exhaled, bracing herself. At one point in the afternoon, Elijah handed her a list of contacts and told her to arrange a last-minute investor dinner at an exclusive restaurant, one that had a 6-month wait list. When she pointed that out, he barely looked up. Figure it out. She spent 40 minutes calling in favors, bribing a hostess with the promise of a future booking for a high-profile client, and emailing 6 different executives their dietary restrictions. Just as she thought she was catching up, he sent her to a 3-hour strategy meeting in his place, where no one bothered to explain what was happening, and she had to pretend she wasn't drowning in jargon. The moment the meeting ended, she ducked into an empty office, phone trembling in her hand as she quickly texted her neighbor, asking if Leo had eaten. The response was quick: he had a snack, but he's been quiet. Think he misses you. By 5, she had barely glanced at her phone, which meant she hadn't checked in on Leo. Her stomach twisted as she stepped into the hallway, finally stealing a moment to call home. Her neighbor answered on the second ring. He's fine, the older woman assured her. We played some board games. He ate some soup. He's been asking for you, though. Guilt burned in her chest. I'll be home soon. She wasn't. Guilt clawed at her, but there was no time to dwell on it. She had 5 missed emails marked urgent, a report to summarize before Elijah's next meeting, and an entire inbox of scheduling conflicts that needed resolving. The minutes she could steal to check her phone were filled with rushed texts. Did he nap? Does he need anything? Before she was pulled back into the relentless current of the day. At one point, while waiting for an elevator, she called just to hear his voice. The disappointment in it when he realized she wasn't coming home yet nearly broke her. By the time she managed to leave the office, it was nearly 8. The subway was slow, the elevator in her building was broken, and she had to run up 3 flights of stairs in heels. She shoved open the apartment door, breathless, expecting to find Leo waiting for her. When she finally stumbled into the apartment, exhausted and frazzled, she barely had time to drop her bag before she saw Leo's small body curled on the couch, wrapped in a blanket that looked too big for him. Her neighbor gave her a sympathetic look. I think he's coming down with something. Violet felt the panic rise instantly. She crouched beside him, pressing a hand to his forehead. He was burning up. His face was flushed, his little chest rising and falling unevenly. She pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and felt the heat radiating off him. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, brushing his damp hair away from his face. He stirred slightly, his lips parting to whisper, Mommy? The weakness in his voice nearly sent her to her knees. She scooped him up, feeling how limp and warm he was against her, and swallowed down the thick lump in her throat. I'm here, baby. I've got you. Something inside her cracked. She scooped him up, holding him against her chest, whispering apologies into his hair. He was so small, so warm, and she had been gone all day, stuck in some corporate nightmare while he had needed her. Her throat tightened as she rocked him gently, guilt settling deep in her bones. This was a mistake. All of it. It was a long night. His fever spiked, and she stayed awake, alternating between pressing cool cloths to his forehead and whispering reassurances into his curls. Every time he whimpered, she held him a little tighter, counting the hours until morning. The weight of the day clung to her, exhaustion sinking into her bones, but she refused to sleep. She had already left him alone too long. When the sun finally started to rise, bleeding soft light through the window, she was still awake, holding him close, promising herself she'd never let work take her away from him like this again. Violet barely made it through the night. Leo's fever burned hot against her chest as she cradled him, murmuring soft reassurances while damp cloths did little to cool him down. He dozed fitfully, waking up in uncomfortable whimpers, curling into her as though her presence alone could fight off whatever had settled in his small body. She wished it could. Every time his breath hitched, guilt twisted deeper into her ribs. She had spent the entire day catering to Elijah Carter's every impossible demand, running around his sleek, air-conditioned office while her son lay here, getting sicker. When the morning light filtered through the thin curtains, Leo finally fell into a deeper sleep, his body heavy with exhaustion. She smoothed a hand over his forehead, heart clenching at how warm he still was. There was no way she could leave him. Not again. She needed the day to stay home, to sit beside him, to be his mother. She sent the text just before 7. Violet, I won't be coming in today. My son is sick. Elijah's response came less than 2 minutes later. Elijah, unacceptable. You're expected at 8. Her exhaustion was quickly replaced by something sharper. Violet, I need the day off. Elijah, not possible. You have a full schedule. Find childcare. She stared at her phone, pulse spiking. Find childcare. As if she had a line of nannies waiting by the door. As if she could just drop Leo off with a stranger while he was sick and feverish. As if Elijah had any right to tell her how to handle her life. A slow, simmering anger rose inside her as she typed back. Violet, I'm not asking. I'm telling you. His reply was instant. Elijah, then I'm telling you, show up, or we'll have a problem. She sat there, fingers gripping the edges of her phone, blood roaring in her ears. By 8, she was in his office, standing in front of his desk with every ounce of sleep deprivation and frustration hardening her voice. You're being unreasonable. Elijah barely looked up from his laptop. You agreed to this job. I didn't agree to be treated like I don't have a life outside of it. His fingers didn't pause over the keyboard. I need you available. My son needs me. He exhaled, finally lifting his gaze. His expression was calm, collected. Dismissive. People balance work and parenting every day. She clenched her jaw. Not when their child is sick. That's what doctors are for. She stared at him, waiting for some flicker of understanding, some sign that he had any clue how detached from reality he sounded. But there was nothing. Just cold logic. You have no idea what it's like, she said, her voice quieter now, shaking with the effort of holding back the sheer force of her frustration. His eyes narrowed slightly. What's like? Being a parent. Being the only parent. Having to choose between making money and taking care of your kid. A muscle twitched in his jaw, but his tone remained steady. This is business, Violet. It's not personal. Her restraint snapped. Not personal, she repeated, laughing without humor. You're telling me that my child, my actual human child, is less important than sitting in some pointless meeting taking notes for you? He didn't respond. She slammed her hands onto his desk, leaning in. I am not your property, Elijah. You do not own me just because you threw money at an auction. His expression flickered. Just for a second. It was brief, but she caught it, the slightest crack in his usual indifference, the first sign that she had actually gotten through to him. Then it was gone, replaced by something unreadable. She straightened, pulse racing. His voice was quieter when he finally spoke. You have responsibilities here. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. And I have responsibilities as a mother. I'm staying home. He didn't stop her when she turned to leave. The next morning, she fully expected to be met with silence, or worse, a termination email. Instead, as she settled into the couch with Leo curled against her, her phone buzzed. Elijah, you can work remotely for the day. Expect a call at 10. She blinked at the screen, reading it twice. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an apology or even a proper acknowledgement of what had happened. But it was something. For the first time, Elijah Carter had relented. The invitation arrived in the form of a sleek white card, placed neatly on her desk between a stack of reports and the latest revisions of Elijah's schedule. The gold lettering gleamed under the office lights. Carter Tech Annual Charity Gala. Formal attire required. Violet stared at it for a long moment, waiting for some kind of explanation. None came. She sighed and stood, making her way to Elijah's office. He was seated behind his desk, focused on his laptop, his expression unreadable as always. He didn't acknowledge her when she stepped inside, so she cleared her throat. Let me guess. This isn't really an invitation. He finally glanced up, taking in the card in her hand before returning his attention to the screen. It's work. Of course it was. Everything with him was. She shifted her weight. What exactly am I supposed to be doing at this thing? Networking. Keeping track of conversations I don't have time for. She raised an eyebrow. So, being an assistant. That is the job. She pursed her lips, glancing down at the invitation again. It wasn't like she had much choice, and honestly, it wasn't the worst assignment. It just meant an extra long night in uncomfortable heels. Fine, she said, slipping the card into her pocket. But you better not make me carry your drink all night. He didn't even look up. Don't let it spill. 2 days before the gala, an envelope appeared on Violet's desk. Inside was a note, written in Elijah's impossibly neat handwriting, along with a crisp stack of bills. Get something appropriate for the event. It's a work expense. The implication was clear: she wasn't to show up in something that would embarrass him. She bristled at the thought, but Naomi had practically danced around the room when she saw the money. If the man wants to sponsor your wardrobe, let him. And so, with reluctance, she found herself in an upscale boutique, letting a saleswoman drape her in fabrics she had never dreamed of owning. She settled on a sleek black dress, elegant but understated, and a pair of heels that felt like they'd betray her by the end of the night. When she handed over the money, she half expected the cashier to laugh her out of the store. Instead, they folded the dress into a pristine box and wished her a lovely evening. The night of the event, just as she was finishing her makeup, Elijah knocked on the door of the suite he had arranged for her at the hotel hosting the gala. She opened it, expecting last-minute instructions, but instead, he held out a velvet jewelry box. "Wear these," he said simply, setting it on the table before turning to leave. She hesitated before lifting the lid, revealing a delicate diamond necklace with matching earrings. The kind of set that looked like it belonged behind glass, not around her neck. She caught her reflection in the mirror, momentarily overwhelmed. It wasn't a gift. It was just another way to ensure she wouldn't embarrass him. And yet, for the first time in years, she looked like she belonged in a place like this. She didn't, of course. That became clear the moment she stepped into the event entrance. The room was filled with wealth, not just the kind that was earned, but the kind that was inherited, old, ingrained in the way people carried themselves. She was surrounded by people who had never worried about rent, who had never worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. She kept her head high, standing by Elijah's side, but she felt like an imposter in borrowed elegance. The gala was everything she expected: grand, polished, and filled with the kind of people who spoke in carefully measured tones, each sentence a calculated move in a game she wasn't sure she wanted to play. She followed a step behind Elijah as they made their way inside, his presence commanding without effort. As they entered, the sound of camera shutters clicked around them. "Elijah. Over here, just one more." Before she could step aside, his hand landed lightly on the small of her back, steadying her in place. She felt the warmth of his touch through the fabric, brief but grounding. The flashes went off again. The moment passed, but the shift in the air did not. It didn't take long before she noticed the whispers. She had been around wealth long enough to know when she was being talked about. The glances, the hushed voices just barely too quiet to catch, it was all familiar. And then, clear as day. "A gold digger." The words cut through the air, crisp and intentional. Violet turned toward the voice, coming face to face with a woman she had seen in magazines and business articles alike. Sienna Langford. She had the kind of beauty that came with old money, flawless, practiced, with an effortless sense of entitlement. She smiled, but there was nothing kind about it. "Elijah, you always were generous," she said smoothly, her eyes flicking over Violet with barely concealed disdain. "Though I suppose we should be grateful you're at least attempting to branch out." Violet felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face neutral. She had no illusions about how the wealthy viewed people like her. She wasn't embarrassed, just exhausted. Elijah, however, didn't move. Didn't react. But when he spoke, his voice was sharp, cutting cleanly through the space between them. "Careful, Sienna." It wasn't a warning. It was a statement. A fact. Sienna blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Elijah took a slow sip of his drink, his gaze steady. "I'm sure you don't mean to sound petty," he continued, voice even, dangerously polite. "That would be beneath you, wouldn't it?" The color in Sienna's cheeks darkened. Violet didn't move. She wasn't sure she even breathed. Sienna let out a small, forced laugh. "Of course. It was just an observation." Elijah smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then next time, observe silently. There was nothing else to say after that. Sienna muttered something about champagne and disappeared into the crowd. Violet exhaled, still processing. She should have been grateful, she supposed. He had shut it down before she even had the chance to respond. But she didn't know why. She had been bracing herself to endure the moment, to brush it off like she always did when people assumed they knew her. But Elijah had stepped in before she had to. And that was unexpected. The rest of the night moved on without issue. She spent most of it lingering on the edge of conversations, taking mental notes, keeping track of names she knew she would have to remember later. Elijah was in his element, navigating the room with practiced ease. He was sharp, efficient, engaging when he needed to be, dismissive when he didn't. He didn't introduce her beyond a vague, "my assistant," and that suited her just fine. Still, the weight of the evening lingered long after the event ended. As the car pulled away from the venue, Violet sat in silence, watching the city lights blur past the window. Elijah didn't speak either. She unclasped the necklace, ready to return it. As she turned to set it back in the box, Elijah's voice stopped her. "Keep them." She looked up, startled. He had an expression she couldn't quite read. "They suit you." The words were simple, dismissive even, but something about them stayed with her long after he left. After a while, she turned to him. "You didn't have to do that." He didn't look away from the road ahead. "Do what?" "Defend me." His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel. She was out of line. "That doesn't usually bother you." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, "It did tonight." She didn't know what to do with that. So she said nothing at all. Violet barely noticed the shift at first. It was subtle, creeping into their interactions in ways that weren't immediately obvious. A slightly less clipped tone when he gave her instructions. The absence of constant second-guessing when she handled a task. The way he no longer felt the need to micromanage her schedule down to the minute. She wasn't sure if it was trust or just convenience, but whatever it was, she wasn't going to question it. Then one afternoon, he called her into his office and, without preamble, handed her a folder. She took it hesitantly, flipping it open to pages filled with financial projections, donor lists, and legal agreements. "What is this?" she asked, scanning the contents. "My next project," Elijah said, leaning back in his chair. "An education fund." She looked up, expecting some kind of corporate angle, something that would turn it into just another strategic investment, but there wasn't one. There was no expected return, no hidden agenda, just a carefully thought-out initiative designed to provide scholarships, school resources, and mentorship programs for kids who would otherwise slip through the cracks. She sat down slowly, flipping through the pages. "This isn't what I expected from you." Elijah raised a brow. "And what did you expect?" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Something colder. Numbers on a page. Not this." His expression didn't change, but she noticed the way his fingers tapped lightly against the armrest of his chair. A habit she had started to recognize, one that meant he was thinking. "I don't believe in wasted potential," he said simply. "It's inefficient." She huffed out a quiet laugh. "Right. Because it all comes down to efficiency with you. Everything does." She didn't believe that. Not entirely. The next few days were filled with meetings related to the project, and to her surprise, he let her sit in on every single one. She listened as he spoke about building long-term sustainability, about ensuring that the funding didn't just create temporary solutions but real opportunities. He wasn't just throwing money at a problem, he was trying to fix it. She watched him with new eyes, noticing the way he shut down half-baked ideas, the way he pushed for long-term plans instead of quick wins. He wasn't just efficient. He cared. And it made her want to tell him. More than once, the words almost slipped out. She would open her mouth, ready to tell him about Leo, about the little boy who had his sharp eyes and stubborn nature. But then she would see the way he carried himself, the way he lived in clean, precise lines, and she would hesitate. She wasn't sure which scared her more, the possibility that he wouldn't care or the possibility that he would. By the time Friday rolled around, the urge to tell him hadn't faded, but neither had her fear. She needed space. Distance. A moment to think. That weekend, she took Leo to the park. It was their usual spot, nothing fancy, just a small green space near their apartment with an old jungle gym and a few shaded benches. Leo ran ahead, his laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air as he made a beeline for the swings. Violet followed at a slower pace, pulling her coat tighter around herself as she settled onto a bench. She had no idea that Elijah was watching. It started with a feeling he couldn't quite place. A strange familiarity that had been nagging at him for days, ever since he had caught the way Violet looked at him sometimes, like she knew something he didn't. At first, he dismissed it. He met hundreds of people, interacted with dozens of employees every day. But as the week went on, something about her felt off. Not in an obvious way, not in a way that made him question her competence, but in a way that made him notice her. The way she hesitated sometimes before speaking, the way she seemed to know him beyond what was necessary for her job. And it annoyed him that he couldn't figure out why. Then, late one night, as he skimmed through an old file in his office, it hit him. A memory, brief, hazy, buried under 6 years of relentless business expansion and international travel. A dimly lit bar. A waitress with sharp eyes and a wry smile. A conversation that had stretched longer than it should have. And then, one night. A single moment in time that had meant nothing in the grand scheme of his life, forgotten amidst the whirlwind of deals and mergers that had followed. He remembered now. Violet. The realization didn't shock him, but it did something else. It made him curious. The sheer impossibility of it all, the fact that she had ended up here, in his orbit, in a way that neither of them could have predicted. He wanted to ask her about it, wanted to know how she had gone from that night to standing in his office, managing his schedule. But he didn't. Because if she had never brought it up, then it meant she didn't want to talk about it. And Elijah Carter wasn't the kind of man to push where he wasn't invited. So instead, he waited. Watched. And when she left the office early on Saturday, something made him follow, just to see where life had taken her after all these years. It was only curiosity. That's what he told himself. Right up until he saw the boy. The boy was small, his dark hair tousled by the wind as he kicked his legs excitedly on the swing. But it wasn't the hair or the grin that caught Elijah's attention. It was the eyes. His eyes. Sharp. Familiar. A cold, unsettling weight settled in his chest as he stepped closer, staying just out of sight. He watched as Violet reached out, brushing a hand over the boy's head, laughing as he shouted something about going higher. It wasn't possible. And yet, as he stood there, watching the two of them, realization crashed over him with the force of something undeniable. The boy wasn't just familiar. He was his. Elijah didn't remember walking to his car. He didn't remember the drive home, or how many red lights he ran, or how his fingers curled so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles went white. All he could see was that little boy, Leo, kicking his feet on the swing, laughing, looking up at Violet with the same sharp, dark eyes that had stared back at him in the mirror his entire life. His mind raced, every logical part of him trying to refute what he already knew. The math was simple. Too simple. The night with Violet, 6 years ago. The boy, 5, maybe a little older. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. He had a son. And she had never told him. The next morning, he walked into the office without a word. His employees must have sensed something was off, because no one dared to stop him as he strode past them, his movements sharp, controlled, like a man holding onto his temper by a thread. Violet was already at her desk, flipping through her planner, completely unaware of the storm heading her way. "Elijah," she started, looking up. "Inside. Now." His voice was quiet. Too quiet. Violet hesitated, eyes searching his face, then stood without argument, following him into his office. The door shut behind them with a decisive click, sealing them away from prying eyes. Elijah turned, leveling her with a look so cold it could have frozen glass. "How long were you planning to keep it from me?" She didn't even try to pretend she didn't understand. The blood drained from her face, her lips parting, but no words came out. His patience snapped. "How long, Violet?" Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Don't lie," he cut in. "Don't waste my time with excuses." She swallowed, her throat working around the words. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He's yours." The confirmation knocked the breath out of him. He had known. He had known. But hearing it out loud was something else entirely. He took a step back, his body moving on instinct, like he needed to put distance between himself and this reality he hadn't asked for. His mind reeled, jumping from thought to thought in a chaotic spiral. 5 years. 5 years of missed birthdays, scraped knees, bedtime stories. 5 years of a child, his child, growing up without him. Violet's voice broke through his thoughts, hesitant but steady. "I tried to tell you." His eyes snapped back to hers. "When?" She hesitated. "When, Violet?" Her fingers tightened around the hem of her blouse. "I didn't know how to reach you. You left, and I didn't have a number, and then when I finally found out who you were," she stopped, exhaling shakily. "You were already gone." Elijah's jaw clenched. "That's not good enough." Her eyes flashed. "It is the truth." He turned away, his hands braced on the edge of his desk, his breaths coming hard and fast. A son. A whole person who existed because of him, and he hadn't even known. Violet took a small step forward. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Do not come any closer." She flinched. He squeezed his eyes shut, his pulse pounding in his ears. "I want a test." Violet inhaled sharply. "You don't believe me?" "I want a test," he repeated, voice steel. She didn't argue. Didn't protest. Just nodded once, her face unreadable. The test was scheduled the same day. The waiting was unbearable. Elijah didn't go home that night. He stayed in his office, staring at the ceiling, his mind running through every possible scenario. He barely spoke to anyone, barely ate. Every hour felt like a lifetime. When the results came in, they were exactly what he knew they would be. Leo was his son. A part of him had expected relief. Some kind of catharsis. Instead, all he felt was anger. Anger at her. Anger at himself. Anger at time, at the 5 years he would never get back. He sat in silence, staring at the DNA test results as if the ink might rearrange itself into something different. Something easier. But the truth was unchangeable, printed in black and white. Leo was his son. His blood. His name should have been on that birth certificate. He should have been there for his first steps, his first words, his first everything. Instead, he had spent the last 5 years building his empire while his son grew up without him. And Violet, she had stolen that from him. When morning finally came, the door opened softly, and she stepped inside, hesitating near his desk. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her shoulders drawn tight. But he didn't care. "Well?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. He exhaled sharply through his nose, dropping the paper onto his desk. It's confirmed. She nodded, but there was no relief in her expression. He should have felt something else, gratitude, maybe, for finally knowing the truth. But all he felt was a raw, gnawing betrayal. You had 5 years to tell me, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Violet flinched but held his gaze. I did what I thought was best. His fingers curled into fists. You don't get to decide that. A heavy silence settled between them. Finally, he pushed back from his desk, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't even know him, he muttered, almost to himself. And that was the worst part of all. Elijah straightened, his posture rigid, his voice colder than it had ever been. I want to be in his life. There was no room for debate in his tone, no hesitation. And you are not going to stand in my way. If you even think about keeping him from me, you will understand the full weight of what I can do. His meaning was clear. He had the money, the power, the legal resources to fight her, and he would. Violet didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she stepped forward, pulled out the chair across from his desk, and sank into it with an unsettling calmness. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. Then she did something that rattled him more than any screaming match could have. She just looked at him. Square, steady, unwavering. As if she was waiting for something. As if she was waiting for him. The air between them was thick with tension, but he wasn't sure who was holding it up anymore. He had walked into this conversation ready for battle, expecting resistance, expecting anything but this quiet, measured silence. His pulse still hammered, his body still braced for a fight that wasn't coming. And that was what made him finally exhale, drag a hand down his face, and sit back down himself, the anger settling. When he finally quieted, she began to speak. Violet let the silence settle between them, let it stretch until the weight of it forced the last remnants of anger from the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, steady. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you left. She didn't drop her gaze, didn't waver. I didn't have a way to reach you. No number, no email, nothing. Just a name that meant nothing to me at the time. Elijah's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. I told myself I'd figure it out, she continued. But figuring it out meant working double shifts, saving every penny, trying to survive. By the time I finally learned who Elijah Carter actually was, I was knee-deep in bottles and sleepless nights, barely keeping my head above water. She exhaled slowly. And you were untouchable. The kind of man people read about in Forbes. The kind of man who didn't have time for mistakes. His eyes darkened, but he still didn't interrupt. So, I raised him. Alone. Through every fever, every daycare payment I could barely afford. Through nights where I worked until dawn and still couldn't pay rent on time. Through every moment where I thought, maybe I should try to reach out, but I didn't. Because what was I supposed to say? That I had your kid and I needed help? That I expected Elijah Carter to care? Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now. Not anger, but something colder. And then, after all those years, life did the work for me. Life threw me straight into your office, and what did you do? You told me you had bought a year of my life. She saw the way he flinched at that, saw the way his fingers twitched against his desk. But she kept going. You didn't care when I told you I had a son, she said, her tone almost clinical now, like she was laying out a list of facts. You didn't care when I told you I couldn't work around the clock. You looked me in the eye and said you paid good money, that I knew what I was signing up for. And when Leo got sick, when I begged for a single day, you told me to find childcare like I was asking for a favor. His hands curled into fists, but his face was unreadable. She shook her head, voice softer now. That's who you were to me. That's the man I got to know. She exhaled. And I hated you for it. The silence that followed was different. He wasn't quiet because he was waiting to argue. He was quiet because he was wrecked. His chest rose and fell unevenly. His fingers pressed against his temples. And then, his shoulders trembled. Just once. But it was enough. She watched as he sucked in a sharp breath, like he was trying to hold it all in, but it didn't work. His face crumpled, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful, and then, he swiped at his eyes, his breath shuddering. Violet stilled. He wasn't crying because of her. Or Leo. He was crying because, for the first time, he realized exactly who he had become. His father. Elijah had spent his entire life solving problems with precision and control. Every deal, every acquisition, every decision, calculated, deliberate. But there was no formula for this. No strategy that would tell him how to bridge the gap between himself and a 5-year-old boy who didn't know him. Leo was polite, but distant. He answered questions with a nod or a shake of his head, barely looking up from whatever he was doing. When Elijah tried to sit beside him during one of his coloring sessions, the boy simply pushed another sheet of paper across the table without a word. A silent offering, but also a boundary. You can sit here, but don't expect much. Violet watched everything closely, cautious but fair. She didn't push Leo to engage, didn't force any kind of connection between them. Elijah didn't know if that was because she wanted to let things happen naturally or because she wasn't convinced he deserved a place in their lives yet. He didn't blame her. So he learned patience. He learned that Leo liked blue crayons more than red. That he hated carrots but would eat anything shaped like a dinosaur. That he slept with a stuffed tiger named Benny, and that whenever he got nervous, he rubbed his thumb over the fabric on Benny's tail. He learned that Leo played soccer, not because Violet told him, but because he overheard her on the phone, trying to arrange a ride for him to practice. The next day, Elijah showed up at the field unannounced, standing at the edge of the grass with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't sure what he expected, but Leo barely reacted. He just kept playing, like Elijah wasn't even there. But Violet noticed. The next time, he came prepared. He learned the game, asked Violet what position Leo played, read articles about youth soccer drills. At the next practice, he stood with the other parents, nodding along to their conversations about leagues and schedules. When Leo stole the ball from an older kid and sprinted toward the goal, Elijah caught himself holding his breath. The shot went in, and before he could think, he clapped. Leo turned his head for just a second, eyes flicking toward Elijah before he jogged back to his team. It wasn't much. But it was something. Days passed like this, moments building on each other like carefully laid bricks. Elijah found himself reading the same book over and over again, The Adventures of Captain Sam and the Lost Treasure, because apparently, it was Leo's favorite. One night, while Violet was cleaning up after dinner, Elijah picked it up from the coffee table and started flipping through the pages. "You're doing it wrong." He looked up to find Leo watching him from the couch, arms crossed. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Am I?" Leo slid off the couch, climbed onto the chair beside him, and pointed. "That's the best part. You have to read it like this." Then, without hesitation, Leo took the book from Elijah's hands and started reading aloud, his voice rising and falling with exaggerated drama. Elijah listened, heart tight in his chest, as Leo read him the entire story from start to finish. One evening, Elijah took them both to his beach house. The drive was quiet, the ocean air crisp when they arrived. It wasn't meant to be anything more than a weekend away, a change of scenery. But as they stood on the back porch, watching the waves roll in under the moonlight, Elijah turned to Violet. "I regret a lot of things," he said quietly. She looked up at him, waiting. "I regret not knowing," he admitted. "Not being there. Not giving you a reason to tell me." Violet's throat worked around a response, but she didn't interrupt. "I don't want to spend my life making up for the past," he said. I just want to be here now. And then, before he could talk himself out of it, before fear or logic or doubt could stop him, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Violet inhaled sharply. This isn't about guilt, he said. It's not about fixing things. It's because I love you. And I love him. His voice was steady, certain. Marry me. For the first time since she walked into his life, Violet looked truly speechless. Then, slowly, she smiled. Yes. The next morning, as the sun warmed the sand outside, Leo stood a few feet away, playing in the tide. Elijah knelt down beside him. Leo turned, watching him carefully. Elijah hesitated, his heart in his throat. Can I show you how to build a sandcastle? Leo studied him for a moment, then gave a tiny, reluctant nod. They built together in silence, scooping wet sand, shaping walls. And then, just as Elijah was smoothing out a tower, small arms wrapped around his neck. Elijah froze. Leo's voice was quiet, muffled against his shoulder. Dad. Elijah closed his eyes, arms tightening around his son. This time, he wouldn't miss a single moment.